Hi class. So we've been focusing on evolution due to natural selection. Sometimes there is evolution not because of natural selection, more just luck of the draw that you happen to be in the right place at the right time, and other species and organisms within your population weren't. And so we're going to kind of look at kind of events that reduce genetic variation in population. And so but you'll see a form of evolution happening. So when we're talking about it, we're going to first talk about gene flow. And gene flow is going to be where we see a reduction in genetic information within your population that was originally at kind of what's called equilibrium, and so it meant it was relatively stable, and then all of a sudden something happens and now we're not getting more genetic variation, we're going to get less genetic variation. And so when we talk a little bit about this, they talk about allele frequency. And so is the kind of in the picture here, you would have the capital A or the lowercase a would be your alleles. The uppercase A would be for like the red kind of chest coat, and the lowercase a would be the alleles for your blue chest coat, and you would talk about how often they popped up. And so when gene flow happens, it means that chances are the blue coat, because it's recessive, would eventually kind of almost disappear from the population because there's so many dominant traits, homozygous dominant traits showing up. And so here's kind of another example of your gene flow, or what we're going to talk about a little bit later is your genetic drift. As you can see, you have so many of these bright pink roses and very little of the kind of whitey light pink ones. They only pop up when the recessive trait's there. But if those pink roses, the light pink roses, keep getting bred with homozygous dominant traits, eventually those recessive ones are going to disappear from the populations. And that's the idea of your gene flow. Eventually you're going to lose the trait and you're going to see a reduction in your genetic variability. Your genetic drift is the same idea as your gene flow, but due to bottleneck or founder's effect. So you're losing a trait, usually because the population's getting smaller. So because that population gets smaller, you're going to lose some traits. When we're looking at your bottleneck effect, this is where we're seeing a decrease in population because a lot of it got wiped out. So you're seeing a huge reduction in the population size, and so you're going to lose a lot of traits from it. Sometimes it can be caused by a natural disaster. Sometimes it's humans. It just kind of depends on what it is. So if you kind of look at the picture here in the top, you have an entire bottle of different random beads. If you're talking about them as a plant species or an animal species, we are assuming that majority of the bottle does not survive the catastrophic event that reduces the population. So now we have a very, very small sample size. And during that reduction of the population, you now lost a lot of the traits that were there. Cheetahs is huge because of hunting. Northern seals. Humans are a big factor in the bottleneck effect. The more species that we kill off and see a rapid decline in a specific population of a specific organism, we are actually taking away their genetic variability and their adaptations to be able to survive kind of a change in their environment or a different selective pressure. So that's the first type of genetic drift. Bottleneck effect, most of the population doesn't survive. Very few that do don't necessarily have the same variation in their traits. And it's all by chance. So now it's not natural selection on who survived the bottleneck effect. It's by who was the luckiest of the bunch. The others is what's known as founder's effect. This is where a small portion of the population moves to a new habitat. So now we're going again from that big size population to a small size population, but not because the other ones were wiped out, but because they moved to a new area. And so then that new population has smaller genetic variability, and that they're going to be much more similar to the kind of ancestors that colonized to that new region. So the other things that kind of help us understand if it's going to be evolution or kind of equilibrium. So sometimes we have it where evolution doesn't happen and a population kind of just stays at status quo. So this is what's known as equilibrium. There's not really evolution happening and it's just staying the way things are. Hardy-Weinberg came up with a mathematical equation to figure out if there is an equilibrium or if evolution is going to happen with a population. And what they use is they actually use the allele frequencies. And so based on how many alleles for this trait show up in a population, they can use this Hardy-Weinberg equation. See, math comes back. And so they're able to calculate if they think this population is going to undergo evolution or if it's just going to stay at equilibrium. For a population to stay at equilibrium, there are 5 factors that need to kind of stay the way they are. It means there's no mutations, so there's no variation. I skipped one. I know, I'm going to go back to that. There's no natural selection, so there's no selective pressure picking certain ones that are better adapted for the environment. There's no movement from the population. There's no kind of organisms allowed to move into this population. The population's got to be large, and it's random mating. There's no sexual selection. It's no like, ooh, that one dances a little bit better, or oh, that one has a little bit nicer color. That doesn't happen. It's just, you're the first mate. Okay, that's the way that leaves it at equilibrium. So if a population isn't at equilibrium, then they are having evolution. And so how we see evolution happening based on the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is going to be the exact opposite of these 5 that we just said. So for evolution to happen, we need natural selection, smaller population, mutations that lead to adaptations, you need movement, and then you also will have your either your gene transfer as well as your sexual selection happening, and you're like, that mating dance was a little bit better. And so that's kind of the idea of staying at equilibrium with no evolution or evolution. And this is based on your Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which is a mathematical equation they use of allele frequencies.